Did you know that Sesame Street was a radical experiment in challenging institutional racism by the Black Psychiatrists of America? Kev speaks. Its members had been discussing for some time the possibility of creating an organization that would address their lack of representation within the key bodies of American psychiatry. But now, as one of the men, Dr. Chester Pierce, later put it, we anguished in our grief for a great moderate leader, and it seemed that the time for moderation on their side was also over. In Peace's words, as we listened to radio reports and called to various sections of the country for the on-the-spot reports in inner cities, our moderation weakened and our alarm hardened. Racism had led directly to King's assassination, and not only had white psychiatry consistently failed to take racism seriously, it had in ways both subtle and overt enabled it. The decision was thus made to organize Black psychiatrists into an independent body that would use tactics of civil rights movement to force American psychiatry to acknowledge both its own racism and its professional responsibility to address the scourge of racism in the country. On May 8, 1969, representatives from Black Psychiatrists of America interrupted the trustees of the American Psychiatric Association while they were eating breakfast and presented them with a list of demands. These included a significant increase in African American representation on APA committees, task forces, and other positions of leadership, a call for the APA to commit itself to desecrating mental health facilities, and a demand that any individual member of the society was found to be guilty of racial discrimination be barred from practicing psychiatry. The most fundamental demand made that morning, however, was that the profession begin to think about racism differently than it had in the past. Racism did not just happen because some bad people had hateful beliefs. Unlike many of their liberal white colleagues who were fascinated by the potential mental pathologies of individual racists, the Black Psychiatrists of America, drawing on new sociological work, insisted that racism was built into systems and structures of American life, including psychiatry itself. For this reason, as some of them put it in 1973, institutional change, as opposed to personality change, are needed to root out and eliminate racism, e-racism. By 1969, virtually every American family home had at least one TV set. As one commentator at the time observed, American homes have more television sets than bathtubs, refrigerators, or telephones. 95% of American homes have televisions. Small children of all ethnicities were growing up glued to the TV screens. This worried Pierce because he was not just a psychiatrist, but also a professor of early childhood education. And from a public health standpoint, he believed television was a prime carrier of demeaning messages that undermined the mental health and vulnerable young Black children in particular. In fact, it was Pierce who first coined the now widely used term microaggression in the course of a study in the 1970s that exposed the persistent presence of stigmatizing representations of Black people in television commercials. It seemed to Pierce, though, that the same technology that risked creating another generation of psychically challenged and damaged Black children could also be used as a radical therapeutic intervention. Pierce became personally involved in helping to design a new kind of television show targeted at preschool children. The show had originally been conceived as a novel way of bringing remedial education into the homes of disadvantaged children, especially children of color. Pierce, though, saw a different kind of potential for a show like this, one that could directly counter and counteract the racist messages prevalent in the media of his time. The issues for him were even more personal than they might otherwise have been at the time. He had a 3-year-old daughter of his own. He thus agreed to serve as senior advisor on the show, working especially closely with the public television producer Joan Gans Cooney, one of its creators. In 1969, the show aired on public television stations across the country for the first time. It was called Sesame Street. It was not only the most imaginative educational show for preschoolers ever designed, it was also quite deliberately populated with the most racially diverse cast. All the multi-ethnic characters, adults, children, and puppets lived, worked, and played together on a street in an inner-city neighborhood similar to the streets in which many minority children were growing up. Each show opened with scenes of children of different races playing together. Episodes featured a strong black male role model, Gordon, a school teacher, his supportive wife, Susan, a good-hearted white storekeeper, Mr. Hooper, and more. Within a few years, Hispanic characters moved into the neighborhood as well. Sesame Street would go on to become the most successful children's show of all time. Over time, though, the radical mental health agenda fueling its creation was largely forgotten. Later, critics would instead increasingly suggest that the show, as a straightforward experiment in early education, benefited white middle-income children more than its primary target audience of disadvantaged minorities, and in that sense had arguably partially misfired. Chester Pierce, however, never lost sight of the hidden curriculum that for him had always been at the heart of Sesame Street. Early childhood specialists, he reflected in 1972, have a staggering responsibility in producing planetary citizens whose geographic and intellectual provinces are as limitless as their all-embracing humanity. What mattered most about Sesame Street was not the alphabet songs, the counting games, or the funny puppets. What mattered most was its vision of an integrated society where everyone was a friend and treated with respect. We all love Sesame Street. The program had originally been a radical experiment in the use of mass media to give the youngest generation of Americans their first experience of what Martin Luther King Jr. had famously called the beloved community, one based on justice, equal opportunity, and positive regard for one's fellow human beings, regardless of race, color, or creed. Thank you for watching.